The Ann Arbor Hospital murders were the murders of 10 patients by the unauthorized administration in their IV of the drug Pavulon in Ann Arbor, Michigan, a VA hospital in 1975. After a vast FBI investigation into the deaths, 2 nurses were charged with the murders, but convicted only for the charges of poisoning and conspiracy. The case was dropped after a retrial had been ordered. This episode contains graphic content. The Ann Arbor Veterans Administration Hospital, VAH, was built in 1953 of reddish brick and generic government architecture. It sits on a hill above a meandering Hudson River and on the edge of the North Campus of the University of Michigan. This placid scene belayed the events that occurred during the summer of 1975 in the hospital. During a few months in the 1975, patients at the VA hospital at Ann Arbor, Michigan began suffering respiratory failure. Some died with extraordinary frequency. In a single 20-minute period on one day in mid-August, 3 patients required emergency treatment to save their lives, and the chief of anesthesiology found that patients responded to an antidote for a paralyzing drug called Pavulon. Pavulon's effects are relatively easy to identify, thankfully. When administered in undiluted doses, it creates the effect on the body virtually unique to muscle relaxants. The individual's heart continues to beat, but the breathing stops. There is no known disease process that has ever been shown to cause this same phenomenon. Of course, the chief of anesthesiology called the FBI right away. He knew this was odd. Most of the suspected victims were patients in the intensive care unit and were being continuously monitored. So the investigators were able to identify 51 suspicious breathing failures. This number was cut to 38 respiratory arrests, which the FBI believed was the minimum number of poisonings. Minimum. Some of the patients and victims were poisoned more than once, and at least 9 of them died as a result. VA records showed that no Pavulon had ever been prescribed for any of the victims. The case series was written up in the New England Journal, and investigators found that a nurse by the name of Filipina Narciso had been on duty in the exact same ward as the deaths occurring during every poisoning. And she was identified by a patient as the nurse who had injected something into his IV just before his breathing suddenly stopped. The nurse, Leonora Perez, was also identified by another patient as having injected his IV just before his respiratory arrest occurred. Luckily for both nurses, both of those witnesses died before the trial. The case against Narciso and Perez was considered by Assistant U.S. Attorney General to be, quote, highly circumstantial, but the defense lawyers felt that it was strong enough that they had to put their clients on the stand, where they seemed to be rather evasive. There was only one charge of murder considered by the jury, and the other charges were all of poisoning people. Later, it was determined that although 2 other poisonings had occurred on a Saturday, which was not a regular day for Narciso, she actually was on duty for both of those poisonings as well. When agents correlated the incidences of the poisonings with the work schedules of the entire hospital staff, only Narciso was on duty in the hospital during every poisoning. Narciso was also identified by one of the patients and victims, John McCreary, who was interviewed by the FBI 2 days after his poisoning. He recalled that he had seen a nurse known to him as Pia inject something into his IV tube minutes before he went into respiratory arrest. Narciso's nickname, by the way, was P.I. Pia. P. It was necessary for the agent to be certain of McCrary's identification, so the agents had Leonora Perez, who was not yet a suspect, and another nurse by the name of Bonnie Weston come into the room on a pretext. McCrary did not identify either one as the nurse that he had seen. Then the agents had Narciso come into McCrary's room. As soon as she entered the room, McCreary's pulse elevated and it caused his heart monitor to sound off an alarm. And when Narciso left the room, McCreary said, "That's the one." As compelling as his identification would have been, it was ultimately ruled inadmissible. But listen to why. 2 days after identifying Narciso, he had a heart bypass surgery. During the surgery, he had a cardiac arrest and almost died. Following the surgery, he was re-interviewed by the FBI, but his story changed drastically, which, based on known facts, could not have been the accurate story. He was diagnosed as having suffered brain damage, and he died prior to the trial. His identification of Narciso was ruled inadmissible hearsay because he would not be available for cross-examination. Both defendants were recent immigrants to the United States, and the trial was marred by accusations of racism. One man, originally slated to be the lead witness for the prosecution, referred to Perez and Narciso as slant-eyed B-words and asserted that there was even a nationwide conspiracy of Filipino nurses to murder veterans. Leonora Perez did not become a suspect until later on in the investigation, though. A patient and victim by the name of Richard Neely told agents he saw Perez inject something into his IV tube. In an effort to enhance Neely's recall, it was decided to hypnotize him. Now, this was unheard of, uncharted territory. It was possibly the first time hypnosis was ever used in an FBI investigation. Dr. Herbert Spiegel, a psychiatrist and hypnotist, was called to place Neely in a trance. While under hypnosis, he seemed to more vividly recall the moments prior to his breathing failure. But Neely, like McCreary, died before the trial began. In addition to Neely, a family member of Charles Gasmere, another one of the victims, identified Perez as a suspect. On July 29th, Richard Gasmere, the son of Charles, had entered his father's room and saw a nurse near the head of his father's bed doing something with the IV apparatus. She had her back to him and did not see him enter. He stood there for about 2 minutes, he said. His father was sleeping when suddenly he sat up in bed and then collapsed. Charles Gasmere was going into pavulon-induced respiratory failure. Richard Gasmere identified the nurse as Leonora Perez. To confirm his identification, the FBI set up a lineup of 18 women wearing nurses' uniforms, 15 of which were Asian. Gasmere immediately identified Perez as the nurse he had seen in his father's room. Richard Gasmere did testify to what he had seen at the trial. After the initial response to the VA poisoning and the need to interview hundreds of people, the investigation settled into the long process of building a case. 2 agents, Richard Gutler and Dan Russo, who had been involved from the very beginning, were assigned to continue the investigation to its conclusion. Gutler and Russo would work closely with 2 AUSAs, Richard Delonis and Richard Yanko. In June of 1976, a federal grand jury indicted Narciso and Perez. They were indicted on 10 counts of poisoning, 5 counts of murder, and 1 count of conspiracy to commit murder. There was a superseding indictment in January of 1977, but it did not substantially alter these charges. The trial began in March of 1977 and was one of the longest and most complex in the nation's history. It did not conclude until July of 1977. Ordinarily, a jury in a federal criminal trial can be picked in less than a day. In this case, it took 4 weeks to pick 16 jurors that allowed for a jury of 12 with 4 alternatives instead of the usual 2, because it was recognized that this was going to be unusually long for a trial. At the conclusion of the trial, the 16 jurors would be reduced by lot to 12. It's noted that the defense expressed great satisfaction with the jury that they had selected. In opening arguments, the government tried to prepare the jury by telling them it would be a long and complex case, and much of the case would be based on circumstantial evidence. There weren't any smoking guns or dripping syringes in this case. Much had been made that the government's case relied heavily on circumstantial evidence as though that indicated the case was weak. Actually, circumstantial evidence is often more reliable than the collection of witnesses. An example of circumstantial evidence often given is if you go to bed at night and there's no snow on the ground and you wake up in the morning and the ground is covered in snow, it's circumstantial evidence that it snowed during the night. Well, the prosecution had to prove in each of the charged poisonings that the victim had been illicitly administered Pavulon within 3 minutes of their respiratory arrest, and that Narciso and Perez were in close enough proximity to have administered the Pavulon drug during that 3-minute interval. Further, it would have to show that there was no one else during the interval who could have injected the patient. Over the course of the trial, the prosecution presented evidence of each of the elements, showing that only Narciso or Perez were in a position to inject Pavulon into the victim's IVs tubes during the critical 3-minute intervals. The government's case used 89 witnesses, 17 of whom were experts. The prosecution never attempted to establish a motive for the poisonings, nor was that required. But it might have helped the prosecution if they could have explained why 2 hardworking, seemingly dedicated nurses would have gone on a poisoning spree. Any attempt to ascribe a motive to the nurses' acts would have been speculative, but the most plausible explanation is that Narciso and Perez, like some of the other members of the VA staff, thought the hospital was critically understaffed. Both Narciso and Perez made comments that indicated they were angry about the staff shortage at the hospital, and that it was believed of the prosecution that the women decided to dramatically demonstrate the need for more staff. When the government rested its case, lawyers for Narciso and Perez had to decide whether or not to present a defense or just argue that the prosecution had not proved its case. The defense apparently believed that the prosecution's case was strong enough that they needed to not only present a defense, but to put the defendants on the stand. This was a crucial turning point in the trial because it subjected their clients to cross-examination. At the conclusion of the trial and after closing arguments, the case was given to the 12 jurors, 8 women and 4 men. The jury deliberated for 13 days, almost 2 weeks, and by all accounts, they conscientiously and meticulously analyzed all of the evidence that had been presented to them. At the beginning of the deliberation, some of the jurors believed that the 2 nurses were innocent, but as all the testimony was reviewed and compared, each juror became convinced that the nurses were, in fact, guilty. The jury also concluded because there were so many contradictions and inaccuracies in Narciso's and Perez's testimonies that they were lying, and they did so repeatedly. Several jurors were interviewed after the trial and spoke about the deliberations and their conclusions. After the 13 days of deliberation, the jury found both Filipino Narciso and Leonardo Perez guilty of 3 counts of poisoning and conspiracy to poison patients. The jury did not find the nurses guilty on all the poisoning counts and acquitted Narciso on the 1 remaining murder count, indicating how carefully they weighed the evidence regarding each incident. The trial judge had previously directed a judgment of acquittal on the murder count against Perez and several of the poisoning counts. And the outrage of the supporters of Narciso and Perez did not subside with these verdicts. The case was extremely complex, and it would have been very difficult to follow all of the testimony and evidence presented at the trial unless you were in the courtroom the entire time. The news reports were also incomplete. Consequently, few people understood the prosecutor's case nor the devastating ramifications of the nurse's testimony on their own defense. Months later, when the trial judge Philip Pratt ordered a retrial, not an acquittal, he seemed to acknowledge that the supporters' outrage, misinformed as it may have been, when he wrote, "The question is not whether any actual wrong resulted, but whether there was created a condition from which the general public would suspect that the jury might be influenced to reach a verdict on the ground of bias or prejudice," end quote. Judge Pratt went on to list several acts by the prosecution that the defense claimed were errors. The judge characterized them this way: no single claim of error raised by the defendants is sufficient to require reversal. There is no dramatic moment of prosecutorial misconduct. What Judge Pratt did find was a pattern of prosecutorial conduct that he believed in total resulted in misconduct that would be remedied by a retrial. In other words, in the course of preparation for and trying a very lengthy and complex trial, the prosecution committed several innocuous errors that, when viewed cumulatively, could have prejudiced the jury, despite, as we know, based on some of the juror statements, that this was not the case. During the long period of the investigation and prosecution of this case, a new U.S. Attorney, James Robinson, was appointed, and Robinson decided not to retry the case. Apparently, he was aware of the politics of the case when he said, in effect, the public perception was that the nurses were innocent, therefore it would not be in the best interest of the government to pursue a retrial. If you're a fan of dark history, don't forget to like and subscribe for more.